All right. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, my embraced family, and welcome to our weekly Wednesday discussion where we are going over a book by Michelle Alexander known as The New Jim Crow Mass Incarceration at the Age of Colorblindness. Currently going over chapter 3 titled The Color of Justice. So last week we started this chapter, really just kind of going over the premise of this chapter, which is essentially, which is essentially that this chapter main focus is to show the reader exactly how the criminal justice system endorses, according to the author's objective course, endorses racial discrimination in the war on drugs. And so last week we just discussed a few of the studies and statistics that the author made reference to, which indicated that certainly there is a disproportionate treatment of the Black community in regards to how the war on drugs is handled in relation to the white community. We discussed that despite the fact that drug use among all the races are relatively the same, even arguably higher in the white community in some areas, the incarceration rate um, towards uh, Black drug users is much, much higher than the incarceration rate for white users. And the punishments are also typically much harsher on Black drug users than they are on white drug users. And so we discussed last week some of the statistics that show that there is indeed some sort of racial disparity when it comes to how the war on drugs is handled. And so now we're going to go into the rest of the chapter to discuss exactly how the criminal justice system endorses or upholds this racial discrimination in the war on drugs. And so this chapter is a very a very heavy chapter, and it has a lot of information that it throws at us as readers. So for my summary, I'm just really going to focus on a few main points, and there are definitely much, like I mentioned before, there's so much information that she uses in this chapter. I encourage all of you who are watching right now to go back and read the chapter as well, if you're able to, just to make sure you don't miss anything, because she discusses a lot of very important, pivotal pieces of information. But I'm going to focus here, just in regards to time, I'm only going to focus on some of the main aspects of the chapter that really spoke to me. And maybe those who are watching feel more than free to either discuss after the summary portion some of the parts of the chapter that spoke to you, or if you're watching through Facebook, feel free to comment in the chat on the Facebook chat in terms of what parts of the chapter really you want to make mention of. So with that, we'll go ahead and go into the meat and potatoes of the chapter, so to speak. And so for part two, like I mentioned before, mainly focuses on educating the reader or showing the reader how the criminal justice system endorses racial discrimination, how it allows racial discrimination in within the criminal justice system, specifically how it affects the Black community in regards to the war on drugs. And the author discusses two primary factors that come into play in regards to how racial discrimination is allowed within the criminal justice system, and that is discretion and authority, specifically discretion and authority in regards to the prosecutors and law enforcement. The level of discretion they are given, and the amount of authority that they are given. And we spoke about the level of discretion that law enforcement is given in regards to traffic stops, in regards to consensual searches, and all these other different tactics that they employ to, which allows them to arrest and convict Black drug users at a much higher rate than white drug users, despite the fact that drug use is relatively the same amongst all the races. So we discussed that to a particular chapter spends a lot of time speaking about the discretionary powers and the authority of the prosecutors, right? And before we go into that, um, she actually discusses a third factor that indirectly contributes to the racial discrimination within the criminal justice system. And that is the aspect and the factor of what she calls what we know as unconscious bias. So, quick question for those who are joining us for the Zoom meeting. Can anyone here remind us what is unconscious bias? What does it mean to be unconsciously biased? What does that exactly mean? Anyone want to take a crack at it, Sister?
Well, I think that, they were, I don't know if this is, the correct answer, but like they're saying, like, if you close your eyes and think about, a crime being committed, people are just, in their mind, they're thinking of a black person rather than a white person. You mentioned
Right.
that.
Yeah, you're making reference to the you're making reference to the study that she references to kind of show the reader what she means by unconscious bias. And so you're on the right track. What I'm asking for though is what is the definition of unconscious bias? What does it mean that you have an unconscious bias towards someone or something? What does that really mean exactly?
Well, I'm not really sure what it said in the book.
Well, just not only but just generally speaking, how do you understand the term unconscious bias? What does that mean? We know what bias means, right? Being biased towards someone or against somebody based on their race, religion, or what have you. What is unconscious bias, though? That's a term we don't hear that much. What do you think unconscious bias means?
Like when you could say something and you're thinking like there's nothing wrong with it, but then it's like it maybe is a bias saying. I'm not sure.
No, I think you're on the right track, Sister Mary. Thank you. I think what you're saying is correct. Essentially, unconscious bias is basically you're being biased without really knowing or meaning to. And this is kind of how the author defines it. Having this bias or stigma towards a group of people without trying to or even wanting to. It's just something that's kind of ingrained in you. And she makes it and she makes reference to a few studies in regards to this. Sister Mary already mentioned one, which is the study in which um, basically participants were asked to close their eyes and just envision a drug user, just a typical drug user. And we've already spoken to the fact that drug use is relatively the same amongst all the races. There's no particular race that's significantly higher in regards to drug use than others. But 95% of these participants in this study, when they closed their eyes, they envisioned someone who was black. They envisioned a black drug user. 95%, despite the fact that drug use is relatively the same, they unconsciously just pictured someone who would use drugs would be someone who was black. This is something that came to their minds, right? She makes reference to another study in which the participants were playing this video game where they had to basically shoot the person who was armed and and not shoot the person who was unarmed. Basically, protect the one who was unarmed and shoot the person who was armed. And these people basically had like wallets, keys in their hands, or a gun. And so the one who was playing the game had to shoot the one who had the gun and not shoot the one who didn't have the gun. And this study showed that most of the people who participated in this game, most of the time, they made a mistake of identifying the black person as being armed when he wasn't. More times when they made a mistake that they mistook the white person as being armed when they weren't. And just kind of show the readers like how prevalent this unconscious bias is. So the next comes to the question is, And this is where I really want to spend some time talking about is like, how does this unconscious bias come to be? And I think if we're all honest with ourselves, every single one of us are affected by an unconscious bias of some sort, just due to what we see on the news, entertainment, all these different types of factors that we are exposed to on a regular basis that indirectly draws a particular picture for us of how we should view a certain group of people. So, for example, us as Muslims, I think, can attest very much to this idea of unconscious bias. That typically, a Muslim entertainment is usually drawn as someone who's a terrorist or planning something bad, and so a lot of Muslims we always argue that due to how Muslims are typically portrayed in the media, this gives people this understanding that Muslims are bad, Muslims are evil and terrorists just due to how they're portrayed in the media. Muslims, we say this all the time, right? So, due to those issues, people develop this bias without even meaning to. And just to kind of, I actually, when I was doing some research today, I actually found two commercials I wanted to share with you guys that were anti-drug PSAs back in the day, just to kind of show you how this unconscious bias towards the African American community may have come to be. So I'm going to go ahead and do screen share. I'm going to share with you guys two small clips. Right, to this one first. And so these two clips, like I mentioned, these were commercials for anti-drug use. The war on drug commercials, both during the Reagan administration and during the Clinton administration. So here's the first one.
Hey, little dude, send your mama and daddy out of the room. I gotta get you up on this. You know who I am. Snake, dealing in weed, coke, crack, your choice. Take one hit and you'll do anything to cop more. Steal from your mama, lie, cheat on your homeboys. But hey, that's the price you pay when you deal with dudes like me. Now, some folks will tell you that I'm dealing in poison. But hey, do I look like the kind of guy that would do that to a kid like you? Yes.
All right, so that's one. And so just if you just note a few things, everyone in that commercial, they were black. He was this guy who he used all these different types of drugs. He transformed into this monster, right? And being exposed to commercials like that really can indirectly create this image for you. And let me show you guys just another. Now, do you think this is unintentional? Who knows if it's intentional or not? But let me show you guys another commercial that's a little bit more comical, but it also just kind of really highlights this issue of misrepresenting the black community in these anti-drug ads. I'm going to play this next one.
Almost 400 years ago, African Americans were brought to this continent in chains. Stripped of their dignity, torn from their families, they never surrendered till they were free. Don't dishonor them by becoming a slave to heroin, cocaine, and crack. Make no mistake, drug abuse is the new slavery.
All right, so that one, that one was real. And that one I thought honestly was really kind of just comical on how it was done. But just to show you that, just to really show you guys how these commercials portray, the African American community. And of course there's many more commercials than this, but just when you're exposed to these type of portrayals, not just PSAs through public service announcements, but through entertainment, through music, through the news, how the news selectively chooses what to report and what not to report. All of us are going to be affected by this unconscious bias in one form or another without even meaning to. And so through this, the author then states that there's no reason to believe that law enforcement and those within the criminal justice system are somehow immune to this unconscious bias. Basically, all of us are affected by it, and that includes those who are within our criminal justice system. Based off of that, the author argues that our court system should ensure that these racial biases do not have an impact on how justice is served. And this is where the author highlights the major problem. She basically says that our court system, according to her, has set a precedent which allows for this unconscious bias to essentially overflow, to essentially be heavily implemented, because due to various cases that she makes reference to, the court system has set a precedent which makes it almost virtually impossible for someone to prove that there is racial bias in any sort of case, except in cases where a prosecutor or someone explicitly states that they did this for racist reasons, or they did this because they're Black, or what have you. They don't take into account anything else except explicit racist intent. So basically, the only way that they could prove there was racial bias is if the prosecutor or the law enforcement officer explicitly said it was for racial reasons, which just no one's going to do. And so she makes reference to a number of different cases throughout our history that help kind of set this precedent. I just kind of want to speak about around 3 of them, just to really highlight for us as to how the court system made it exceedingly easy for those within our criminal justice system to racially discriminate without virtually any worry of punishment. And so the first case she makes reference to is a case known as McCleskey versus Kenneth. And this case essentially set the precedent that racial bias in sentencing could not be challenged under the 14th Amendment, which is supposed to guarantee equal treatment under the law, unless explicit evidence is presented. Like we mentioned before, that evidence basically having to be if they explicitly said it was for racial intent or what have you. Anything else was considered irrelevant. And so she goes into the case. So basically, a man by the name of Warren McCleskey was convicted for murdering a white officer. And due to him killing a white officer, he was given the death penalty. But him and his team of defense attorneys from the NAACP essentially made an appeal, arguing that this sentence was unjust based on how the rate of death sentence convictions were given to Black offenders than white offenders. And so they make reference to a study which indicated that basically those who killed a white victim were 4.3 times more likely to be given the death sentence than someone who killed a Black victim. And just to kind of give a little bit of background information, prosecutors, I think a lot of us know this, that prosecutor attorneys have a lot of power. They arguably have the most power within our legal system. They can prosecute someone for any charge that they want. They can be as intense or as lenient as they so desire. And the author actually has spoken about this in previous chapters. So this study shows that for some reason, prosecutors are much more likely to prosecute someone for the death sentence if their victim was white than if they were black. And so they presented this to the Supreme Court, this study, to argue that there is racial bias in this conviction. And this is where the problem came to be. So the court did not deny the authenticity of their study. They acknowledged this study was definitely valid. But the argument was that they would need to prove that this particular prosecutor explicitly intended and explicitly convicted Mr. McCleskey for the death sentence because of race. And the only way for them to really do that is if they had like an explicit statement from the prosecutor saying, I am prosecuting with evidence because you kill a white person or because you're black, which just is not going to happen. And so based off of the court basically telling them that no matter what statistics that you provide for us to show that this is a problem, unless you have explicit evidence of that prosecutor going for the death penalty for racial reasons, we can't accept your plea. We can't accept this as a appropriate response. So due to that, this set a precedent that if anyone wants to basically claim that they are being incarcerated, they're being convicted unfairly based on their race, the only way for them to prove that, according to what the author is showing us, would be to have the one who is convicting them explicitly say, I am doing this because of race. Something that, or at least something that obvious, right? And so this set an extremely high standard for proving racial bias, and basically shut the door for any concept of unconscious bias. Basically, unconscious bias didn't matter. You have to prove they explicitly meant to do it for race, and you have to have extremely strong evidence to do so. So that's one case that the author makes reference to. Another case she makes reference to is known as United States versus Armstrong. And so in this case was about someone named Christopher Lee Armstrong who was convicted for drug possession, right? And essentially, his lawyer noticed that for some reason, throughout at least about 1 year, all of their defendants, or none of the defendants that they would get for these types of cases for drug possession were white. This was for crack cocaine specifically. And when the defendants saw this data, they were confused because, like I mentioned briefly, when it comes to crack cocaine, there were actually more white users than black users. Despite that, for some reason, and this is on the federal level, by the way, just kind of clarify that these were federal defense attorneys. This was for federal crimes. Despite that, for some reason, they never received any white defendants. It was always black or brown, even though drug use for this specific drug was more prevalent in the area in the white community. And so this caused them wanting to gain access to the persecutors' records in order to basically see what they're doing. They basically suspected that it was possible that these prosecutors were deferring white offenders and sending them to the state courts, where they would typically get much more lenient sentences than if they went through the federal system. And so they approached the court and wanting to make a discovery motion, right? Because basically there is no way that the prosecutors are going to willingly give them access to these records. So they approached the court for a discovery motion in order to get a subpoena, basically in order to force the prosecutors to give them access to these records in order to check the data, right? And they made reference to this issue about how there seems to be disproportionate conviction rate for black offenders than white offenders, even though white offenders are higher in this case. And what happened was basically the court system acknowledged the sufficiency of their evidence, but did not grant them that motion, because they said basically they would need to prove that there were white offenders who should have went through the federal system but didn't. And this is where we kind of fall into what the author calls a catch-22. So let's kind of clarify what we're saying here. The court essentially was telling Armstrong's legal team that if you want us to give you a discovery motion in order for you to get those access to those records, you would have to prove something that you can only prove if you had access to those records, is essentially what happened. And so due to this kind of forces, so like I mentioned, a catch-22 moment, where you're asked to present evidence in order for you to get evidence that you need. So if you want the evidence that you need to prove that the evidence that you need is there, which that just can't be done. So again, this set another precedent to where even if you wanted to do discovery in order to get that information and that evidence that you need to prove there's racial bias, you need evidence for that as well. Typically evidence that you would not be able to get unless you were able to subpoena the prosecutor, which just isn't going to happen if they have enough evidence. So this just kind of shows us how the court system was making it exceedingly difficult to prove racial bias in any sort of case, because prosecutors are given a lot of discretion and a lot of authority. They can do essentially, when it comes to charging someone, they can charge them for whatever they want. They can be as lenient with you or as harsh with you as they want. And since the court system makes it so difficult to prove that there's racial bias involved in some of these decisions, someone who is black or brown, they find themselves in a very difficult position to be in. So that's the second case that she makes reference to. And she also makes reference to studies that indicate that prosecutors respond to similar criminal activity differently based on race. So there's studies that show that prosecutors will again convict someone more harshly based on race. And again, a major reason for these disparities is conscious and unconscious bias, right? And so the last case I want to make reference to that the author speaks about is the case known as Perkett versus Elm. This is from 1985. Well, no, sorry, not 1985, but this is because in 1985, the court held that the 14th Amendment prohibits discriminating based on race for choosing a jury. Now we're going into choosing a jury. The Supreme Court ruled that it is illegal under the 14th Amendment to choose a jury or based on race, essentially. Despite that, the court has repeatedly upheld convictions of black defendants by all white juries, despite the fact that they said that it is illegal for a prosecutor to choose a jury based on race or to reject a juror based on race. So the question is, why is this the case? How does the system allow the prosecutor to be in a situation where they can have an all-white jury against a black defendant? And so the answer to this question is actually very simple based on what the author told us. That's essentially a prosecutor cannot reject a juror based on race. They can reject a juror based on anything else. Like virtually anything else that they want, they can reject that juror for. And so she makes reference to this particular case in which a prosecutor was asked why he rejected black jurors in this case. In this particular case, the jury was an all-white jury. No black jurors at all against a black defendant. And there were candidates who were black, but the prosecutor rejected them. And so the prosecutor presented his reasoning or her reasoning as to why they rejected these jurors and didn't allow them to be on the jury. And I'm just gonna read out loud to you guys what this person said, because it's absolutely ridiculous, and just kind of really highlights just how much discretion prosecutors really have. And so this is what the prosecutor said when he said why he didn't choose those black jurors to be on the jury. I struck juror 22 because of his long hair. He had long curly hair. He had the longest hair of anybody on the panel by far. He appeared not to be a good juror just for that fact. Also, he had a mustache and a goatee type beard. Juror 24 also had a goatee type beard. And I don't like the way they looked. The way the hair is cut, both of them. And the mustache and the beard look suspicious to me. So this prosecutor is saying he rejected those black jurors because their hair was too long, and he didn't like the type of beard that they had. He didn't like that style. Now, when you hear that, obviously that sounds ridiculous, right? And the Court of Appeals actually was about to drop the case because of that, because they said that's not a proper, legitimate reason to question someone's ability to serve on a jury. But the Supreme Court upheld the conviction, because the Supreme Court said that as long as the sitting judge of that case accepts the prosecutor's reasons, then it's fine. So basically, even if it's something as ridiculous as their hairstyle, type of clothing, or how they have their beard and mustache, as long as the sitting judge accepts it, then it's considered legitimate. And just kind of add on to that, the goatee and the hair braids are typically associated with the black community, right? So while a prosecutor cannot choose a jury based on color, they can choose a jury based on everything else: how they have their hair, what they're wearing, all these other really minuscule things that have nothing to do with one's ability to serve on a jury. And so kind of in retrospect, after going through all these three cases, we see that due to these different rulings the Supreme Court enforced, this is quite a few things. One, it set an extremely high standard for those who want to prove that they were treated unjustly by law enforcement or the criminal justice system based on their race. An extremely high standard that can only be proven if one explicitly confessed to doing it based on race. And number two, that those within the criminal justice system, like prosecutors and law enforcement, are given much power and discretion to arrest and convict people for whatever reasons that they want, as long as there's an explicit mention of them about race. And based off of these reasons, the author says that these are the factors that play a huge role into how the war on drugs upholds racial discrimination due to these factors. Now, after this, she actually speaks about quite a few other things. She speaks about the police system, the law enforcement system, and how there's various studies that show that they disproportionately target Black communities over white communities, even though there are, like I mentioned before, drug use is prevalent in white communities just as much as prevalent in poor Black communities. And but we'll go ahead and stop there, because like I mentioned, this chapter is very, very long, and I've already spoken for a very long time, despite the fact that this is only the second half of the chapter. So we'll go ahead and stop here. So we have about 15 more minutes. So I want to go ahead and open the floor to any questions or comments. So before that, Sister Rashida, actually, she's not able to join us now, but she did have a comment about unconscious bias. And essentially her comment was that I think a lot of times we underestimate how unconscious bias has an effect on us and in our society, and how easy it is for us to lose track of how unconscious bias has an effect on us. And she shared with me this picture of these like two black women who I think it was some sort of advertisement for like a cosmetic commercial or something, and like the slogan was like, you know, so beautiful it's criminal or something like that. And you know, Sister Rashida asked like, you know, why did they use that particular, or I don't that particular word usage. Now, Allah knows best, of course, what the reasons were, but even smaller things like that can draw this particular picture for you, right? And so, in that, I want to go ahead and open the floor and kind of first ask a question to those who are joining us, and that question really is, what do you have there ever been a moment in your life where you felt that, oh snap, I kind of feel like I did some sort of unconscious bias towards somebody, or oh snap, I know I'm not racist or I have anything against racist people, but for some reason I feel uncomfortable for saying this or saying that. Or is there something that you have seen on television or what have you that drew a particular picture for you as to how you view a particular group of people? Or is there anything you saw on television, anything that you watched that seemed to give a particular indication or a particular narrative about a group of people?
I think I on like TV or stuff, but you know, sometimes because you know I'm a white American and just as a Muslim, people assume I'm from a different country, and so they come up with this like a little bit racism, and then they start hearing me talk, and they're like, oh, where you from? And they then I think then they start treating me differently just because I'm a white American. And I mean that hasn't happened in a long time, but when I used to be a new Muslim and I was like, I don't know, I felt like people were just generally racist against Muslims. So that's what I've experienced.
Oh, that's a very perfect example, Sister Mary, especially I think from the Muslim perspective about Muslims typically being seen as foreign. And I think we do see that a lot in our media. For example, whenever we see how is a Muslim to be portrayed in television, usually it's someone who's from the Middle East or someone from another country. Typically, they're wearing different clothes. I think even I remember. I think a friend and I were having a discussion about this one commercial. It was like it was like a Jew, a priest, and a rabbi. The Jew and the priest, they were, of course, they were white Americans. The imam was someone who was Middle Eastern. So, due to that, we have this stigma that all Muslims are foreigners, right? So that's I think, a very good example.
And there's also somebody in a WhatsApp group. They talked about his name is Jamie Mujahed Fletcher, and he I guess he does education for the Hispanic, the Latino. And when he was first Muslim, he was wearing, like, he went and spoke in front of a church, and they were saying that he was dressed like an Arab, like with a dastashi and a kufi and sandals. And then he spoke to them, and his words And then the one guy goes, how did you learn to speak Spanish so good, you know? So, and he's like, you know, he came from the, you know, he's Latino, you know, came from that community in Houston. And so you know, it kind of reminds me also what we're talking about here, that the way you're dressed is the way people will portray you. And there's so many, I know there's so many, like I have a lot of friends that are Hispanic too. And like, you know, see other Spanish, you know, Mexicans or, you know, Spanish. And then, you know, people will, then they'll be starting to talk with them and they're like, oh my gosh, you speak Spanish? How do you speak Spanish? And, you know, they're either Latino or, you know, wherever they're from. So people just don't associate Muslims with Spanish speaking.
No, right, absolutely. And I think especially us as Muslims, many of us have that experience and understanding from the Muslim side, right? That we always complain how Muslims are simply foreign and this and that. We don't like that, and so I think from today we also do what we learned about the African American community. For those of us who are not part of it, we can definitely sympathize. And I think due to that understanding, those of us who are watching and tuning in, we need to make sure, just like how we do not want others to view Muslims in a certain way based off how the media is seeing. Like we're always, out on the streets talking about how Muslims need to be viewed in a more appropriate light. We need to also have that same mentality for the black and brown community, right? Those who are black and brown, because I mean, the way they're portrayed in media, if I'm being completely honest, is even more prevalent and even worse than how Muslims are portrayed. I mean, we just think about the commercials that I showed you guys. The one about the guy yelling who's a drug dealer and he's turning into a monster and all this stuff. And we think about movies and all this stuff and how usually those who are the bad guys or the drug dealers are always like usually people from who are black or brown. Usually it's like the um, the white, the tried and true white American who's saving the day, and all these things that we see in our cartoons and in our media and in our movies and TV shows and what have you. Things are, of course, starting to change because I think the media is becoming a little bit more aware of this issue, but the damage has to a certain extent already been done. So we need to be aware of these issues. Keep in mind that we are not um, immune from falling into unconscious bias and just kind of really doing our best to check ourselves. And what I mean by that is just really doing our best to fight against that unconscious bias we have within ourselves. It's going to be there. But we really just have to do our best to remind ourselves that as Muslims, we know that we do not judge anyone based on their race. We judge everyone based on their actions. So it's very important for us to know that. With that, let's go ahead and close, inshallah. It's now Maghrib time here in DFW. So, inshallah ta'ala, next week we'll be starting chapter 4 of the book. I think after that we have about 3 more chapters. I think there may be a couple more months before we finish the book, inshallah. So we'll go ahead and close. اللهم سبحانك وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.